It's the 87th Precinct podcast. This is the only podcast in the world dedicated to Ed McBain's seminal series of police procedural novels, which began in 1956 with Cop Hater and ended in 2005 with Fiddlers. There were 55 books in the series, and today we're looking at book number 49, the final 87th Precinct tale of the 20th century, no less, and it's The Big Bad City. My name is Paul Abbott, and I'm joined, as you might expect, by my colleagues Mr. Morgan Brown.
Hello.
And Mr. Stephen Royston.
Hello.
And we're glad to be back together after a slightly longer break than we expected between episodes. You can call it our summer holiday if you want. No sooner had we been allowed to get together again in person than... Well, the truth of the matter is I sort of became unwell. And I'm not frightened to say that, although I've got some physical matters still ongoing, still being investigated, it was really a sudden and quite severe change in my mental health state, which put everything on hold. And it was quite a struggle in a time that was already quite difficult to cope with. So I just wanted to be honest about that with everyone. And talking to friends and family, engaging with people like you, our listeners online, has been very, very helpful for me. And, you know, if you are struggling, make sure you talk and find your way to help. I know it can be difficult. I know I've got a way to go. But people are kind and there is help out there. And I hope you're all well, as I think we're all okay at the moment. I'm certainly feeling a lot better now than I was last month anyway. So it's good to be back as we sort of enter the... Well, it's funny, but on the 49th out of 55, it does feel like the next book will be like the start of the home stretch, doesn't it, really?
I think it does, yeah. New century and all that.
Yeah.
Millennium, even.
But on to much better news, as you may have seen on our social media, that one amongst our number is now a published author. So, Morgan Brown, I have in front of me here, in the physical sense, that it's an actual thing. A copy of On Track, The Damned, Every Album, Every Song by Morgan Brown. What's this all about then?
Well, it's a book. It's a book about the damned. If anyone is in any way curious about the works of English punk pioneers, The Damned, and would like to read some nerd talking in depth about every track on each of their albums in order, then this is the book for you. But pretty much that's exactly what it is.
Yes, it's amazing to be sat here with you, the author, and the book as well. It just actually a thing in my hand is amazing. Yes, you must be very pleased that the process has happened. You got through it. You got it published. It's here.
It's quite exciting. Yeah, it didn't feel real at all somehow until the actual book arrived in its physical form. Really, even when it had been submitted and I knew it was coming out, it didn't actually feel like it was a real thing. So it's very exciting. Yeah.
Yes. Well, we're all very proud of you here.
Aww.
And yes, it's going to be Steve-O's just done a silent book huffing of Morgan's book there. You know, this is as brand new as any of the books we've looked at.
It should still be fairly fragrant, hopefully.
Do you get to choose the pictures as well?
More or less, yeah. I think that the chap at the publishers did select a few of them. I selected some of them. Some of them are actually taken by me from the backs of records. Hopefully you can't tell too much which ones taken with my phone camera.
You got to do what you got to do.
All look pretty good, I think.
Yeah.
So have you picked any of their albums as your yearly choices during this podcast?
Do you know, I haven't as yet. We've been going through a spell where if you read the book, you'll understand why I didn't want to pick any of the particular albums that we came across. But there might yet be scope, so we'll see how we go.
Yeah, I'm just having a quick look at the contents here and the years attached to them.
Test out your bona fides about this book, you know.
Yeah. Well, let's just remember the most important thing about this book is that it's got my name in the dedication. So there we go.
It sure has. It's also got a mention of this very podcast on the back cover, I think, too. So I'm hoping that will send some curious punks heading in our direction.
Yeah. Well, it's available from the usual Globo retail sites that you would buy things from, but it's also available from all the various different booksellers, isn't it? It's get it anywhere.
Yeah, I don't know how many shops have got it in physical form, but most mail order places have. I know particularly if you're in London, then All Ages Records in Camden, a very fine shop that does need everyone's support at the moment, does have copies.
Ah, there we go. Excellent stuff. So, yes, well, that's an excellent way to start this, because last time we did an episode, none of us was a published author. This time, one of us is.
Next month, all of us.
yeah, get right in. Okay, right, so let's get back on track with crime then, and return to Isola, the big bad city itself. After we first had a quick look at the year 1999, the year this comes out, and McBain's activities and the like. Yeah, 1999. I mean, it feels strange now to be doing this, like a historical look back at what feels like yesterday, as we've said several times, basically since the 90s began, I think. Yeah. 1999. Everyone was worrying about the Millennium Bug, of course, which in the end did absolutely nothing.
Millennium Bug, the coming of Chris Jericho.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, see, was the Millennium Bug about whether a computer could count past to 2000?
Yeah,
it seems a very strange thing to be worried about, really.
It was the idea that it was going to just reset to zero, wasn't it, when it went past
1999, yeah. Which would have... Yeah.
Sounds like you should have better things to worry about, really. And hardly surprising that the computers could do that.
Yeah, everyone thought it was going to set off nuclear warheads and all kinds of things.
Yeah, I think it's a bit too much people watching war games.
Yeah, I remember having a book that was one of those, what was he called? Charles Berlitz, the guy who used to write about the Bermuda Triangle and such.
Oh, right, okay.
And I'm sure one of those books was called Doomsday 1999.
Fantastic.
How the world was going to end in 1999.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't.
No, probably pack this book off to charity shop in the year 2000, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. What happens if you go home and it's on your coffee table?
Yeah,
and
well,
it's
I've not seen
Bermuda
it
Triangle theory of mystery.
Yeah, I'll be thinking somehow Charles Berlitz has broken into my house during the next hour and a half.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, no, I think possibly the only things that were affected by the Millennium Bug may have been like cheap electronic toys and things like that. Like maybe you woke up one day and your speak and spell wouldn't work or something like that. But, I don't know, Little Professor, one of those things.
That's right, yeah. Maybe the occasional lower budget alarm clock radio might have been slightly thrown. That
you'd bought with petrol tokens that you'd saved up for years and then got... Anyway, let's just do a quick summary. I've only got a few things from 1999 that are important. 1st of January 1999, the euro becomes the official currency of the Eurozone, but only in cheque and electronic form, not in cash form. That doesn't happen until 2002. And either way, doesn't affect the UK. 4th of February, it's a New York issue. So I mentioned this just because of the crime aspect. So there's an unarmed man in New York called... he was a West African immigrant called Amadou Diallo, shot dead by 4 police officers who were on an unrelated stakeout. Now, I mention that simply because we're about to talk about a book which involves someone being shot dead by police officers who get the wrong person as well. You know, it's not entirely figments of McBain's imagination, and the reality is often much worse than... the imagination of it. 12th of February, Bill Clinton was acquitted in his impeachment. When impeachments of presidents were like fun. A laugh almost by comparison to things that have gone on since. 7th of April, the World Trade Organization, this is important, the World Trade Organization rules in favour of the United States over Europe in a long-running trade dispute over bananas.
All right, okay. What were they arguing about?
I have no idea. I didn't look into it, and there was no hyperlink on the page to take me to more information. I just had to take it on faith.
Yeah, it seems a bit odd that. I'm fairly sure we don't import American bananas or America import European bananas.
There's not many European banana farms, are there?
Exactly, so one can only wonder what on earth he could have been arguing about.
Yeah, who knows? Perhaps we'll never know.
Perhaps Europe or America were I don't know, trying to sell things purporting to be bananas and weren't. Maybe that's what it was about.
Wood shaved and painted into the shape of bananas.
So, yeah.
Tired snakes painted yellow. I don't know. Anyway, 1st of June, Napster debuts.
Wow.
So the start of the changing landscape of music consumption, really, things like Napster, which I didn't really ever have anything to do with at the time. And
there was another one just after that I think I had, and I can't remember.
There was things like LimeWire and Kazaa, and I think I used Kazaa a little bit, but I was never much for piracy, so...
No, I never got involved in any of that.
I remember downloading a couple of songs just for the novelty, but then it was just like, all right, well...
Yeah, I think Metallica told me not to.
Yeah, indeed, don't download this song.
Also, I just like having records. So.
Well, exactly, it was just like... took about an hour to download
a really low-quality MP3 or something.
So,
you can get the entire Beatles back catalogue on a format and quality that you'll never, ever enjoy. So, yeah. But it's an important thing in terms of how it changes the landscape of music consumption, and particularly how long it took the music industry to react to this, treating it like a terrible, weird thing that they wanted to shut down when actually they should have been
harnessing it,
and it took them ages to. 1st of July, the Scottish Parliament is officially open following devolution from the central London, United Kingdom Parliament. We had a solar eclipse on the 11th of August, which I remember seeing, actually. It wasn't in full totality where I was, which would have been Stoke-on-Trent at the time, but you could see it. I remember the 1999 solar eclipse.
It was on the Isle of Skye.
Oh, right.
Very, very clearly.
Did you see much of it up there? Because that would have been...
No, I think it was worse, wasn't it? The further north you got, curiously. So it was much better in like Devon and Cornwall, I think,
believe
wasn't
so. Yeah. And on the 31st of December, Boris Yeltsin resigns as president of Russia, bringing in Vladimir Putin as acting president. And
acting,
yeah. Yes, well,
he didn't
and
hang
so
around very
on.
long, did he? Blast from the past.
Yeah, imagine. Right, let's get on to Evan Hunter and a bit of what's going on there. Well, what does he do? So I've got 1998 and 1999 to talk about here. So 1998 sees The Last Best Hope come out, which is the final Matthew Hope novel. We have a short story called Where or When, published in a compilation called The Best of the Best. Big Bad City comes out in 1999. We also have Driving Lessons, which is a short novel, part of the Criminal Records series that Otto Penzler puts out. I recently bought that, haven't read it yet. A short story called Barking at Butterflies is published in a compilation called Murder and Obsession, also by Otto Penzler. And also we have the short story I Saw Mommy Killing Santa Claus, which was a gift made available to the customers of the Mysterious Bookshop, as run by Otto Penzler. So Otto was doing a lot of work at the time with McBain and, getting extra little bits and pieces out there.
Is he the man you met in New York?
Indeed he is, yes. And on TV, we have, on the 17th of March 1998, the last of the My Town series, the second Japanese series. It's the adaptation of Till Death, 110 minutes, script by Toshio Kamata. Oh, God, I really would love to see those. I really would. A 90s series based on the early books. Such a frustration not to be able to get those. And I mean, other than that, what was occupying his time around this period was a stage musical. So we've talked about how much he wanted to write a stage musical.
He always seems to be doing that, doesn't he?
Well, yeah, exactly.
Can I have a wild guess that it didn't come to anything?
Well, let me fill you in. So there's this thing called The Night They Raided Minsky's. So Evan Hunter had made the acquaintance of a chap called Mike Ockrent, who was a director. They'd met earlier in the decade, and then later on, he asked Hunter to write a book for a musical, which was to be based loosely on a film from the 60s called The Night They Raided Minsky's, which itself was based on a novel from earlier in the 60s, which purported to be about a famous raid on a burlesque nightclub called Minsky's by the Legion of Decency in 1925. And the idea by Mike Ockrent was to sort of put a British girl into this New York setting, this American setting, who's looking for some American and somehow becomes involved with striptease and burlesque. So, sounds very titillating. But the show got as far as the start of rehearsals. They agreed to stage it in LA and then move it to Broadway. And, for Evan Hunter, this was like one of his big dreams of all time, which was do the book for a successful stage musical, because he really does love the format and the idea. And it gets to 1999, and very, very sadly, Mike Ockrent, the director, succumbs to leukemia. So the plans are all shelved for it, and it moves into the hands of another production company. And by 2002, it's not being produced, and eventually it opens in 2009 with a book by someone else at the end of it. So another, that's sort of the last throw of the dice for McBain in terms of a big grand ambition. Just it was never going to happen.
Oh well, so close.
Yeah,
he must have had like half a dozen.
He had a lot
reasonable
of
attempts, didn't he?
And a few that did get on the stage, but he never managed sort of the big stage musical that he wanted. He had a couple of performances of plays, but that was it. So couldn't win there, really.
Oh.
So let us turn our attentions to The Big Bad City, which is book 49, as I said, published on the 14th of January 1999, start of the year. And the amazing thing is, we're back to the very first publisher of the entire series.
Ooh.
Yeah, so books 1 through 18 of the 87th Precinct were published in Perma Books, paperback edition, which became Pocket Books. So that's between 56 and 64. And the original hardcovers were Simon & Schuster from 59 to 64. So now these, certainly the American editions, are now in Simon & Schuster and Pocket Books again. So we're talking about things, it's a bit like, this is what I say about it feeling like we're going on to the final phase. Things seem to be coming full circle.
Yeah.
Like he's gone back to his original publisher. For now, in the UK, it's published by Hodder and Stoughton and the New English Library. And the dedication's interesting in this one, because the dedication says, "This, again, is for my wife, Dragishka Dimitrievich Hunter." But of course, no 87th Precinct book before this has been dedicated to her, except in the retrospective republishings. But actually what it is The Last Best Hope, the Matthew Hope book, was the first one dedicated to Dragishka,
That makes sense.
Okay,
which had come out just before this. So they had married in 1997, which was shortly after the publication of Nocturne. So this is the first 87th Precinct book which is dedicated to her. But yeah, so there we go. We're all caught up with 1999 and McBain and his various things. And we get to The Big Bad City, which, as I was doing a little bit of research in this, so Erin MacDonald, who you may have heard being interviewed on this podcast, we've referred to a lot, wrote the Evan Hunter, Ed McBain companion book, makes a very interesting point, which I think is a good starting point for this. This book's called The Big Bad City, but it's one of the ones that has some of the least city description in it whatsoever, which is
Very true.
It's an interesting name for this book. I don't really get why it's called it. Any thoughts?
No, it's quite odd, really, because one of the things reading it is it's less dark and gloomy than most of the books that preceded it, which are all a lot more big bad city.
Yeah, It's curious, isn't it? It feels like almost like McBain forgot to give it a title, and some sort of office assistant at the publisher's been given the task of thinking of a title at the 11th hour, and had just pulled something out of thin air. Because it couldn't really be less to do with the book. And given that quite often the titles are really carefully selected to have sort of multiple meanings and resonances within the book, it does seem really odd.
Yeah, and we know he uses the phrase Big Bad City quite a lot. He peppers it throughout, a lot of the stories. But, there's nothing in this that is reliant on the fact that this is the city. And because you would think with a title like this, compared to some of his titles, that this would be all about like different bits of the city, the way, the different areas contrast or...
Absolutely.
But it's not at all.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. It'd be a much more appropriate title for some of the 1990s books, certainly.
Yeah.
But not this one particularly.
No, so strange title to kick us off with, really. I don't know what I would call it.
Something to do with nuns.
Yeah.
Oh, Nuns and Cookies.
Nuns
Yeah.
and, that's,
McBain's Nuns and Cookies.
Can you imagine that would be such a left turn in his titling of things? Nuns and Cookies.
That was maybe the first thing the office boy pitched before
Yeah.
they came up with the big bad city. Yeah.
Yeah, I just feel like a fallback title, really. So, I mean, yeah, you read on the inside of the cover of mine, it just say like the first thing you need to know about this city is that it is big, which reads like the start of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Space is big, but other than that, yeah.
Secondly,
distance.
it is bad. Thirdly, it is a city.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. There is one section of this where he talks about the fact that the city is like, you know, several other cities put into one. He does use it as a bit of an excuse to make fun of like some sort of
Made up places.
yeah,
Yeah.
sort of redneckville type places, which is quite funny. But it's it's not reliant on that. So we better get into attempting a summary. Do you want to try it, Steve?
Oof, right, well, see what I can put together. Well, there are, I suppose, two primary stories out there. There's the nun story, and then there's the cookie story. So which should I start with, really?
You do the nun story.
The nun story, right. Well, a body is found in a park. I can't remember. Is it Grover Park?
Yeah, it's Grover Park.
Probably. Strangled young woman, 20s, something like that. And it takes them quite a while to identify who the person is, and they realise it's a young woman who then turns out to be a nun. Mm-hmm. Then spend a lot of the story concerning her speaking to various people that knew her, wide circle of friends, some issues about money, but nobody's really sure. And then the brother ends up getting in touch. She's not from Iceland, sorry. And you realise there's some family issues with dead parents, and then she kind of rebelled to become a nun, even though she had no previous religious leanings, as it were. And then you're thrust into a whole backstory about her, whilst being a nun, taking a nun sabbatical and becoming a rock star in some terrible name band that then goes on a tour of the Deep South, and it just all gets quite bizarre for a bit.
It does.
And so, yeah, it's a funny old story, I must admit, really.
They're tipped off to a left turn into the performing arts by the discovery. Is it Paul Blaney who discovers her implants?
Oh, yeah, so she's got like breast implants that, yeah, it just seems such a weird, unnecessary bit of plot, as though it's like to titillate, but I don't think it is. It's just a bit weird.
It's just, yeah, it's a very interesting, yeah, it feels odd to call these breast implants the MacGuffin, but they are the MacGuffin that get them into the investigation, aren't they? That lead them down this can't just be a sort of
I think
crime of the moment.
No, they can't. I suppose they just kind of maybe included in the story to give her a bit more of a mysterious background. She's a nun, but then she wanted to be a rock singer, and
if you're going to be a rock singer, you need
apparently, because
enhanced boobs.
They discovered that whole angle from that, because I guess they traced the surgeon who and then from there it's like, oh, the manager brought her in, because obviously that's the first thing that you do.
Yeah, so it just seems a bit of a like that wouldn't really happen, because it's not as though she becomes like a big solo singer. She's just a member of like a rock band, touring like little diners in swamp towns.
It's very strange, and I'm sure we'll get round to our feelings again about McBain tackling popular music topics.
Yeah, he seems absolutely dreadful at naming these bands as well, because he's got a couple of names here and they're just all terrible, aren't they?
Oh yeah. We'll get round to that, but let's just park that for a second.
So that's the main story.
Yeah, and Morgan, cookies.
Oh, the cookies, yes. So at the same time as all this is going on, the city's also being plagued by a burglar who has been nicknamed by the media the Cookie Boy.
They didn't think very long about that.
They didn't think too hard about that. The idea being that He will break into people's apartments and steal their valuables, but then, by way of compensation, leave them a little package of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, which is lovely. And so that's going on in the precinct. And then we actually catch up with the cookie boy, and we see sort of him preparing for a job, don't we? Kind of from his perspective, and we catch up with him and follow him on a job. He's been doing this for years and getting away with it, and we catch up with him just as everything goes wrong.
Yes,
very wrong
indeed.
Yeah, there's quite a lot written from his perspective in this, and he's. He kind of feels he's got a noble art, doesn't he? And he doesn't see any shame or whatnot in his profession, and he's quite proud of what he does, and he feels leaving a cookie is part of like a thank you, or like he has this disastrous afternoon out, doesn't he? Basically, where it all goes wrong for the first time.
Yeah. And gluing the whole thing together, the rest of the book together, is another subplot, which is the return of Sonny Cole, who was the person who shot Corella's father in Widows and got off with the crime in Kiss, I think it is.
Yeah.
So how long goes Widows and Kiss then now? Because
time
always seems to stretch out in these books.
In the 87th Precinct, time is strange and elastic.
Yep,
yeah, sure is.
Yes, it certainly is. Yes, well, if we look back, we find Widows was book 43 and Kiss is book 44, so that's 1991, 1992.
Oh, right, okay.
So, I mean, obviously he's not writing as many books as he was back in the 50s and 60s here, so it's, it's the 6 books ago, really. But for them suddenly to emerge again, or this character to suddenly emerge again with the notion that if he doesn't kill Corella, he thinks Corella's going to come and get him. Because he doesn't know Corella. Corella's the sort of cop who wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And so we have a pursuit of someone who doesn't know they're being pursued, and it ends up somehow with Fat Ollie involved as well, because we can't do without Fat Ollie at the moment. We're sort of about to enter his super heyday, really, aren't we, in the next few books?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, 3 things going on. The nun story is, I suppose, the A plot. The cookie boy is the B plot. And then we have, this glue of this thing from the past happening. And I think that's what makes me feel a bit strange about this book, is that if you were picking this up as a new reader, why would you care about this person pursuing this cop? Because you don't know anything about the backstory. Because, it says he killed his father. But then he also has a load of family stuff with Corella, where his sister is now seeing the lawyer who failed to get this guy jailed. So Steve Corella's sort of mind is all over the place dealing with this.
Yeah, he doesn't often do that because, obviously every book's got aspects of all the backstory of all the characters, but he normally does it in such a way that actually that kind of doesn't matter, and you can come to any entry as a total newcomer, and you're not particularly at a disadvantage. But yet with this one, a lot of it would be totally meaningless to you, really.
Yeah.
So it is a little different in that. Yeah, and then the big bad city name as well, doesn't really apply to the nun story, because most of her story is not even within the city, is it? It's from other parts of the country.
Quite a lot of the big bad stuff that happens with her definitely happens, a lot further south.
And the Cookie Boy story is probably the least big bad story. It's almost written as a fairly whimsical crime to start with, certainly.
Yeah.
Although it ends up being quite nasty.
Yeah.
Even when it does get quite nasty, it's almost kind of farcical.
Yeah, it's all it all happens kind of by accident, doesn't it? Almost, if you see what I mean. It just seems a bit of an odd collection and name.
I think, talking about the nun story. As we say, a lot of this happens down south, and it happens in flashback. So, having taken a sabbatical after joining the church, she goes off to tour with this band. And I think, McBain's problem is that he doesn't really understand that bands operate on anything other than a professional level. So, they go off and get an agent, they get money to have her breast augmentation. And I mean, he doesn't linger particularly over the breast thing in this.
No.
Given his propensity for lingering over the female figure in certain books, he actually in this one doesn't particularly. It's more of a simple fact to create a clue to create. But I don't genuinely think that, especially in 1999, you don't go and say, "Oh, I'll join a band." I don't know. I mean, it's weird. And that sort of band, the fact that he sends them off on this set of shows in these backwater places suggests they are not.
They wouldn't be signed up with anyone, would they?
No, absolutely not. It doesn't seem remotely like a realistic sort of concept of how small touring bands would function.
Is that him putting kind of what he knows about like musical theatre, for example, which I think he does know quite, and then just using those same principles to like the music industry and just theorising that they must operate in a similar way,
or even just musicians who work in other fields. It's like the idea of getting an engagement in a supper club or something. It's like what's the equivalent of that for a rock band? It's like, well, you probably wouldn't really get a residency in some little place like on the bayou or whatever. But it's like...
No, it's all
it's quite hard to read when you are a musician and you've done tours and you think actually that most of the work you do is yourself, and it's people phoning people. This would have been phoning people up rather than emailing. Although I think this is the first 87th Precinct book to actually mention email existing. So on page 17, I think. Yeah, I mean that's the type of band that the characters in this is not what McBain describes, and the thing is, I know we've got worse music industry stuff to come in the books, at least one book to come anyway. And we've talked about this stuff before. But what's the name of the band? So
they called the Five Chord,
were they the Racketeers?
So she joins a band called the Racketeers, and they change their name to the Five Chord, which is the worst name for a band I've ever heard in my life. And I've heard some terrible names.
It's not a great name. And also, if it was going to be a band, it kind of sounds like a dodgy... like
jazz, like a jazz group or something?
I was going to say maybe early 80s sort of new wavy power pop. I'm imagining them as like a band that's been formed in the wake of the Knack, but nowhere near that good. I don't know. Skinny Ties?
Possibly.
But doesn't he mention like a bunch of grunge people?
They aspire to be like R.E.M. or Alice in Chains or Stone Temple Pilots, and you think...
And yet she auditions with like a load of old Rolling Stones songs and things like that.
And they mention Janis Joplin and things. It's like it's an odd hodgepodge of different things.
Yeah, he's always on... the book with all that rap concert as well. He's always on fairly thin ice when he does come back to it quite a few times, really. But never his strongest topic, I don't think.
No, it's not. But it does mean that exactly this doesn't take place in the big bad city. The actual events that have led to the murder of this person has happened all down in Florida, essentially, hasn't it? Which is also an excuse for him to bring in Matthew Hope in a crossover, which, if, like us, you haven't read the Matthew Hope books, and you're not going to go and read The Last Best Hope just for the first link to the 87th Precinct, it's a bit of a strange one again.
Well, I was going to ask, is that the first time that there's been the crossover? Because those characters clearly know each other in this. Well, and I'm just thinking, have I forgotten there being previous Matthew Hope crossovers? Well, there hasn't, has there?
Well, there has, but it's in the Matthew Hope series.
Oh, right, there you go. Right, so that's why it doesn't make any sense in here.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense for us who've read 48 other books.
Yeah.
So, a bit... Yeah, peculiar.
Why he rings up a retired lawyer at this point, Corella rings up a retired lawyer to ask him to fax tens of pages of information, which is just helps Corella, but actually it's a bit of a get out clause in the plot, because he's just basically if you're reading this not knowing anything about Matthew Hope, Corella's just rung someone up and gone, give me a load of information I need, and they've gone yes, and they do.
I'll fax you the solution now.
Yeah. Faxes and emails, wow.
Brave New World.
Dealing with the future.
What if a text message is ever referred to?
Well, blimey, yeah, we only got up to 2005. So I don't know. It's an interesting one. I think he gets a bit Rashomon again, because we get the same story told from different perspectives, and we know he's used that device a couple of times. He likes his Kurosawa-esque referencing.
Yeah, he's got like the same chapter, half chapter, verbatim, hasn't he? But just with the character perspectives flipped.
The story just retweaked the first time, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, which is interesting, because he does play sort of with... Because it pivots on a gender issue, which is quite interesting, the way that comes across. Yeah. But, yeah, I struggle a little bit when he's writing about musicians. He does... I don't know. I don't know what I make of it, really. It's an odd one. I mean, if we jump away from that again, because I know we're going to have to jump around on this one, to get to the Cookie Boy, which I think Steve-O's right. It is played totally whimsically,
I think it is, yeah.
Up to a point. And then there's a massive shock sequence, which I think is probably the best bit of the book, for me anyway.
Yeah. I know I sometimes rattle on about the Richard Stark, but it kind of has echoes of the scenes always in Richard Stark's books where everything goes totally tits up, and all the characters are somehow find it impossible to stop it happening, but it nevertheless just like a runaway train.
Totally, everything spirals ludicrously out of control
very, very quickly.
Yeah,
and what started as like a bungled burglary ends up with 2 people dying, and
it sort of goes from Benny Hill to Pulp Fiction in like a heartbeat, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
I think that's actually, saying that out loud, that's quite a good description of it. Really. It's stumbling across a sort of bawdy woman making love to a delivery boy, which is about as cliche a sort of thing as you can have, to, she's got a gun, and it all goes horrible.
Yeah.
But I like the character of the Cookie Boy. Is he's in this dramatic moment. Everything, his world, his plans have all gone to absolute pieces. But once it's over and it's happened, he's like, well, walk away then.
Yeah.
I'll eat one of my own cookies and walk away.
Yeah. Oh, wonder if I'll be on telly.
Yeah, clearly a bit, not altogether thinking straight all the time, is he, I think?
Yeah.
But doesn't it turn out that he's like a Gulf War veteran as well?
Yes.
Yeah, so... But then the other thing that's happening in this book is, I think, at least 3 times the 87th Precinct gun somebody down, don't they?
Well, stuff happens, certainly.
So, right at the beginning, there's like a scene in the squad room where Felon manages to smuggle a knife into like the prison cage with a knife concealed in his butt cheeks.
Yes.
In his
in his crack, I think.
In his crack. And they have to shoot him, and then they shoot down somebody who they think's the Cookie Boy, but then it isn't. And then, well, at the very end,
Yeah. So,
somebody
you're
else
absolutely right,
gets, yeah.
So the media attention, he does hint at the media attention on the police in this book at certain points, because of the various incidents that happen and the various shootings and stuff. So I imagine there's a whole other book to be written that would go immediately after this, which would be the amount of questioning and queries from internal affairs about what happens with, it's Meyer and Kling and a sort of team kill somebody, Corella and Brown end up killing somebody, Parker and Corella shooting somebody at the start, although I think they survive.
Yeah, they seem to shrug it all off very well in this, don't they? Don't know.
Yeah, it's an odd one, really. Yeah.
And I think Parker does his usual, very unexpected, heroic catching of the, I think it's the Cookie Boy, isn't he, who does with and it's written in everybody can't quite believe it's Andy Parker who does this brilliant pursuit and rugby tackles the fleeing criminal.
Yeah, no, it is. It's very good when they describe that. He puts in just one the most sarcastic line.
Andy Parker, brackets, Andy Parker, question mark.
Yeah. So I'm just going through some of the references to things I've spotted in the book. There's a few references to sort of contemporary things like ER. He describes the paramedics turning up as if they were all on ER in this opening sequence. It refers to a writer who was a New York writer called Irwin Shaw, who I know nothing about. We've got a woman called Helen Daniels, which, if you're of our age...
Yeah, I had a chuckle about Helen Daniels.
Who was a character in a TV show called Neighbours. Yeah. I'm sure our Australian listeners will have picked up on that as well. So that was quite hard to take seriously if you've heard of Helen Daniels, who was ubiquitous on British television and at one point at tea time every day of the week.
And lunchtimes as well.
Yeah, indeed, yes. The coroner in this book is Carl Blaney, not Paul Blaney. I can't remember if at this point we've actually resolved the fact that he's used two different names for Blaney, because he does later make them into brothers, doesn't he?
What? He explains his own mistake, essentially.
Yeah, I can't remember if we're past that point or not, but we've had Paul and Carl by this point as well, both described as like having the same violet-coloured eyes and things.
He didn't decide that it didn't try and do the thing of claiming that one of them was the middle name that some people used, like Stanley did with Bruce Banner, who he accidentally called Robert Banner, I think, for a little while in early Hulk comics.
Was he David Banner in the? Was that just the TV series?
David Banner in the TV series. I think he started out as Bruce Banner and then became Robert Banner for a couple of issues and then went back to being Bruce.
like Conan Doyle got very confused about how the chronology and how many times you have to work out how many times Dr. Watson was married, and basically, like 3 or 4 times in order to be able to explain the periods of being married and then not married, and he's not married after he's been married, but then married again.
You've got to forgive them, I suppose.
Well, yeah.
Oh, God, yeah.
But, I mean, especially writing pre-social media, now you probably wouldn't be able to get away with it because of the amount of people who would be immediately on your case.
Oh, God, yeah.
Imagine Conan Doyle's email lighting up.
Well, yeah, I suppose Conan Doyle was always writing, jumping around like times as well, wasn't he? So, you probably need one of those Minority Report, wall charts in order to...
or lots of bits of paper and string between them. I think there's something interesting in here about Corella and his family background when they've got this scene with him and his family talking. But it says Corella would be 40 years old in October. So suddenly we've got an actual birthday date coming up for the man. If we take it as read that this is 1999, that this is set in 1998, 1999, and Corella's just about to turn 40, which makes us all older than Steve Corella, which feels very strange.
He would also make him about 5 years old when he was...
it's interesting that he sort of pinned him to actually a significant birthday.
It's a bit odd how he's not aged him a little bit more, because there would be no harm in that.
Yeah, I suppose if he did age him, you'd be wanting to ask more questions about why he's detective second grade all the time. He's clearly a first grade detective, and he's never a first grade detective. Yet Ollie Weeks is.
Yeah. Yeah, so your perception of him in those early books, I suppose, I would probably think in his 30s, but maybe he would have been in his 20s then in McBain's mind, maybe.
But I suppose it's a bit like when you watch film and TV from the sort of 40s, 50s, 60s. Everyone seems to be older than they actually are. Lots of suits, and from the age of 14 you'd be wearing a suit rather than what we'd wear.
Well, and I've no idea, but I bet if it's anything like over here, I suppose like detectives were probably retiring at 50, 55, weren't they?
I'd imagine so.
So, if you're 40, you've not got that long to go, really, maybe.
Yeah. But it's interesting.
So you didn't want to get them too in their 40s in case it was like...
But it gives McBain a chance to muse on age as well, and about Hollywood studios not wanting to hire older writers because they have this idea that older writers have forgotten what it's like to be younger, which, again, feels like McBain going... why aren't I getting any jobs anymore writing screenplays or something like that?
I wonder if the frequent attempts to write about popular music are an attempt to prove that he's still in touch with young people, which if they are, I can totally see why studios maybe weren't hiring him to write things for the hip young kids.
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, and it does also give us a chance to learn a little bit more about Corella's family background. It turns out that his father's father was an immigrant from Italy, and the place that they mention in this book, they don't mention a specific thing. They mention he came from a village from between Barry and Naples. Barry. Sounds like Barry in Wales.
Barry and...
Barry.
Barry and Merthyr Tydfil, was he?
Yeah.
A little village
from
up in the valleys.
From Barry and Naples.
Next to Snooker Club.
From Barry and Naples, and actually if you sort of split that journey in half, it turns out to be Ruval del Monte, which is where McBain's father's father came from originally.
Right,
so
okay,
Makes sense.
There's even more McBain in Corella there as well. And then the usual thing about Corella, being an American rather than an Italian stuff, which obviously is a theme throughout this as well.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, of course Teddy goes to trial in this one, although you don't actually see the trial, for kicking someone in the last book. And that's just dealt with and then finished and off.
Yeah, very short and sweet.
Which is another odd one for a new reader, really. Yeah, there's quite a few references back in this one, isn't there? There's like references back to the Pusher. When they talk about having once interviewed someone called Ernest Hemingway.
Oh, right, yep.
Because they think they're looking for a woman called Marilyn Monroe.
What's she called? Mary Lynn Monroe.
Yes, yeah.
And it's quite funny because at one point the Cookie Boy's like, why didn't I Marilyn Monroe? He says, well, why didn't I get her real name? And
yeah. There's a Beatles reference in here. Every now and then, though, somebody's replaced, like Pete Best was by Ringo Starr. But that's rare, very rare. And I will say, if I get this edited in time and out tomorrow, that will be coming out on the anniversary of the day that Pete Best was fired from the Beatles in 1962. Just by pure coincidence, actually, 16th of August. And what else have we got? Yeah, and later on, in fact, there's a bit where, towards the end of the book, after supposedly the successful resolution of the Nun story, Corella and Brown are together, and they're having a drink around at Corella's house, and there's references back to tons of the early books. I mean, there's loads of reminiscences. What have I got?
Maybe it's because it was like 1999. Maybe he thought, because there was a lot of, looking back and looking forwards in that year, as I seem to remember. So maybe he thought it was quite a good moment to do that, really.
Yeah, talking about when Kling was a patrolman, and Hawes wasn't even on the squad. So
Hawes has almost disappeared, hasn't he? Really?
Yeah, he has. He hasn't had much to do for a long while.
Mm.
Yeah, Roger Haviland and
Hernandez
as well. Yeah.
And yeah, he was worse than Parker. Sometimes I think Parker is Haviland come back from the dead, which is exactly how McBain's described it. And then, stuff
King's
about
Ransom.
Yeah, King's Ransom in there, Virginia Dodge, and the bottle of nitro. And then, it's Claire Townsend, the deaf man tunnelling under a bank. I'll be 40 in October. Where did it all go, Artie? Having a crisis there.
Yeah.
No, it's an interesting book, I will say. I think we better sort of try and pull our thoughts together on it, really, because, as I suggested, I'm not still... It's enjoyable. Yeah. It is enjoyable. It's less dark than some of the recent ones, and that's always a nice relief after you've had some of the nastiness of the recent books. But it's... I'm not sure. What do you think, Steve-O?
I think it would have worked better if the Nun story was stronger.
Yeah.
Maybe. Because I think the other elements of the plot are quite interesting, a good way of, kind of explaining the city and, some of the backstory as well. But I think the backstory itself requires a little bit too much prior knowledge. Yeah, and the Nun story just, I don't know, doesn't seem to hold together very well. Difficult to explain, really.
Yeah, a story,
certainly not the best, but certainly not the worst. It's an entry with its merits, but certainly not one of the strongest, I don't think.
Yeah, how do you feel, Morgan, about how this all sort of comes together? And
Yeah, I agree with Steve. Really, it does have its weaknesses. It is really enjoyable. I mean, I definitely. It was my first time reading it, and I did really enjoy it. The nun story, it's not great, is it? What are you going to do? I quite enjoy the daft bits about musicians that don't make any sense in a perverse sort of way.
Oh no, I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean.
But yeah, it does kind of take you out of any kind of realism that might have been forming somehow, doesn't it? But it's still enjoyable.
Because the crime ends up being nothing to do with her being a nun as well. Like, that's a whole...
She sort of almost didn't need to be a nun, almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an odd thing.
It's like he'd kind of written most of it and thought, right, where am I going with this? Who killed her? Whilst the typewriter's still going.
I don't know if it's almost like there's just too much misdirection to the point when it doesn't really make that much sense, but... I enjoyed the Cookie Boy.
Yeah,
I
thought
that's a decent plot line, and I quite enjoy Sonny Cole kind of following Corella and learning about him too. It's interesting seeing him getting talked into this sort of paranoia about him, and then being really hot for revenge, and following him, and gradually sort of almost starting to empathise with him a little bit.
Yeah.
I quite liked that. But then it just sort of, it doesn't really go anywhere particularly.
No, and I mean, it's easier to appreciate that if you know the backstory a little bit.
Oh yeah, if you came in, I mean, none of that would make any sense or have really any impact if you hadn't read the things you needed to have read in advance. Having read those, I quite appreciated that. But yeah.
So perhaps all a little bit more rewarding for the long-term reader rather than a new reader, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was very much thinking of people who'd stuck with the series for at least sort of a few books, rather than it's not a jumping in point, is it at all?
No, I don't think so.
It's more looking back for people who've been there for a while.
Yeah, okie dokie. So, we better score this thing then, really, and then I'll give you some contemporary reviews from the period, and I'll go first. So, as I say, not entirely convinced by the thing as a whole. Elements of it, fairly enjoyable. It's good McBain writing, a lot of it, but I think I agree with you, Steve. It does feel a little bit like he's occasionally not known where he's going with the stories, and... what we say about spoilers, if you've listened this far, it doesn't matter. The Cookie Boy story ends with him just getting on a plane and leaving.
Yeah.
They catch him, he goes on bail, and he just goes away.
He goes to work in his family's meat packing factory in Europe.
In London, no less.
It's like, all right, okay.
See ya. It just feels like it's... Yeah. I don't know if that's there to sort of reflect the nature of, this does happen, people skip bail. And that you do have a scene with Nellie Brand, which I like Nellie Brand as a character. I like when she comes in to sort of play hardball lawyer with these various shifty attorneys that get brought in. Yeah. With this guy, the Cookie Boy, saying, "I didn't kill them," and his attorney going, "No, it's fine, and he was just like, "No, I didn't." And he's like, "No, yes, that's okay, I believe you," type stuff. Anyway, that said, I think I'll keep it short and sweet. For me, it is a 58 Police Shields book, this one. 58 Police Shields. And I'm going to go to Morgan.
Okay, well, I mean, I do absolutely agree, really, with everything you've said there. Although I quite like that the Cookie Boy completely escapes. I think it's good to not have everything always wrap up too neatly with these things. Show that there are kind of... I mean, maybe flaws in the system, or maybe just, that's how the cookie crumbles sometimes. You can't always... It was already coming out of my mouth before.
Oh, God, that's not the joke why you wrote it, is it?
Oh,
it
God,
could well
I
be.
hope not.
Yeah.
I'd like to imagine that Ed McBain's got more taste in these matters than me. But I quite like that sort of unresolved element of it. So I'm going to be a little bit more generous. I'm going to say 65 Police Shields.
65. And Steve-O?
Yeah, I think I would be low 60s. I think it's about six and a little bit out of 10. 62, I think I would go.
Splitting the difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which gives us, with our patented rounding down system, 61 police shields for the big bad city. Let's see if 6 out of 10 is reflected in some of the contemporary reviews of it from the time. So our old pal Marilyn Stasio has been writing for the crime section of the New York Times for the last few books we've been doing. Here it is, she says, just in time for those read-for-your-life months in the dead of winter, a new 87th Precinct novel from Ed McBain. It happens to be a good one, too. From its swaggering title to the ending that leaves Steve Carella, the detective, has been on duty in this series since 1956, except he can't be because he's only just turning 40. Weak in the knees. Although he's not above a few nun jokes, although he does give them to his characters rather than just write them into the narrative. McBain does his usual high-wire act of balancing the tone and content of his separate plot lines, respectful of the nun and her sad little secret, amused by the cookie monster, vengeful towards the psycho. It's not done by brute force either, but with dialogue. When it comes to the voices of this city, McBain is the man with the golden ear. Okay, yeah. We know Marilyn likes him anyway. A review from the Irish Times. A new 87th Precinct novel is always to be welcomed. Although the 87th Precinct stories must be running towards the 100 at this stage, not quite. Each new instalment seems as fresh as the last. How does McBain, also known as Evan Hunter, do it? Doesn't really say much about that. Other than review from the Kirkus Review, which is quite a long one, so I will extract this. The case of the murdered nun turns into the sort of sober, expert, if not exactly dazzling investigation that McBain could turn out in his sleep. I think I'd agree with that. The Cookie Boy caper, by contrast, sparkles like a 4th of July skyrocket, then fizzles.
It's quite similar to our reviews, that.
Yeah. How spoiled has McBain gotten his fans? It's all too easy to forget that his mid-grade adventure for the 87th, his 48th, it's not, it's his 49th, continues to set the gold standard for the genre he invented. So, yeah. That does sort of agree with us.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough.
Yeah, and then the Publishers Weekly thing is... Well, Publishers Weekly reviews aren't really reviews so much as sort of descriptive things. McBain invests many storylines with the off-the-wall humour, a startlingly real cast of suspects and witnesses, and a terrifically entertaining mix of cop dialogue, gritty city atmosphere and action. McBain is so good, he ought to be arrested. And that's the pull quote that we see on loads of the books there as well. I did mention, actually, on Twitter that there's an audiobook version of this read by the author. I think he only did 3 himself. And you have to remember he had a load of operations on his throat by this point, and I get a feeling perhaps that he just thought, you know what, if I don't do these now, if I don't capture my voice reading my voice. So yeah, it's an unabridged version. It runs over 6 hours of McBain reading this.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Which would be interesting to hear how he delivers this sort of story. Perhaps, because I think he also does Nocturne as well, which is a very different story to this one.
Yeah.
Anyway, there we have it. That's the Big Bad City. And the next thing we're moving on to is book 50 in the year 2000, which is The Last Dance. A title I'm sure we'll have to muse on, really. Because, you pick a title like that for your 50th book, you do wonder what he was thinking. So we'll have to speculate on that for the next one. But we'll be back with a little bit of a bonus episode to look at book covers and a bit more about 1999 and all the things that went on during it. So do join us for that. Until then, I'm going to say goodbye, as will Mr. Morgan Brown.
Very well.
And Mr. Stephen Royston.